Okay, so in this video, I'm going to try and cover as much from the handouts that I've given you via Moodle. And what we'll do here is just go through the user interface and follow effectively this document that you have in Moodle. Layout, getting started, and a couple of other tips and tricks. So let's look at the main user interface. You may get it looking like this when you open it for the first time, or not. There are some default layouts that you can find up here in the file menu. So if we go to the subjects layout, we'll get it looking like this, which is how the layout that we'll use for calibrating subjects and loading that in. But that's not necessarily what you guys need to be doing when you are working with this. So what we'll go through at the moment is how to customize the layout, how to set up keyboard shortcuts and mouse controls, and how to customize the UI layout for working in tracking. So let's just go over the user interface at the moment. So on the top line, we have the file menu with our normal kind of file menu, subjects, processing, objects, general, where we can find preferences, which we'll come back to in a second, layouts, and then help. Below that, we have some shortcut buttons, which are quick ones for creating a new scene, opening and saving, undo and redo. And then what we have the tab shelf here, which has different setups or different buttons and icons for different operations. And it kind of goes along in the order that we would do things normally within sort of post workflow for mocap. We'd start off with our subject setup, then we'd move forward to processing data, then we might look at adding extra objects or customizing the scene, and then the panels menu covers another bunch of menus that we have open. If anything is highlighted green in the panels menu, then that means it is open already and you should be able to find it in the UI below. So if we look here, we have subject setup, which is here, subject management, which is docked, and subject parameters, which is docked here. So I can close all of these down and get rid of them if I so wish. And then we're left with the main viewport. And then if I'm looking at our data cleaning tools that we normally use, we would look at a labeling menu, which pops up on the side. And then we would look at maybe subject management that we do have. And then we could look at the next one, which would be marker editing. These are probably the three most important menus you'll use when you're cleaning data. But you can undock anything and have it floating like this by dragging on this kind of sort of title bar. And if I want to redock it, I can drag it over and drop it onto the square for each area. Yeah. So I drop it in the middle on the square. It becomes a tab down the bottom that we can manage. So this is kind of how we can drag and drop menus and set them up. I could have the selection menu. I could have that as a dynamic window that I can dock when I click it. Even though it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. They're a bit flaky. I don't tend to use this kind of docking thing. I would tend to park it on the left-hand side. See what I mean? I'm trying to click on it. What I can do is if I want to park it on the side, I can do it like that and it will kick in and work. Yeah. And then if I wanted to stack any more on top of that, I could do, say, attributes over here, which would open. I can drag and drop across the square to go on top to create a tab at the bottom, or I could take attributes and dock it at the bottom to split it half and half. Lots of different ways of customizing the layout and setting up how you prefer to work. And then when you've done that, you could save that as a new layout by saying export custom layout. And in here, I would do it as Alex C layout. Save that. And now if you look, it's popped up as an option within this. So I could change back to the subjects layout and then jump back to Alex C layout. And it would be as I left it. So that kind of covers our menus and panels and how these work around in the interface. But the main window that you will see is called our main viewport. Now there are a number of different options that we can have with this layout option. At the moment we have it set to 3D scene, and this is the drop down menu in the top left hand corner, picks from a number of options that you can have for this viewport. We can also change the layout using these layout buttons at the top. We can create floating windows. We can also create a floating window as a copy of an existing view if we want to do it quickly. And we can also split the main viewport into different configurations. Single view, quad view. Once it's changed to a different one, then we can use this top left-hand menu to choose a different view for each. So I could go to data health for that one. I could come down here and change that one to the graph. And here I could come and look at the individual cameras that we've got. Because we haven't got anything loaded in, there's not much context to these windows at the moment. And then you can select each one just by clicking in that window to highlight it green to make it the active window. So if I highlight the 3D view and then go back to single, it will pop back up as a single view. Now I am orbiting, panning and zooming using buttons on the mouse and the Alt key. And an important stage that you all need to kind of do when you set Shogun up will be in the general preferences to allow this Alt key. Normally, it's set by default. Alt is used to select in the viewports and it will rotate normally. So I would go into General, Preferences, Interface, and uncheck the box. Normally it's checked, but have it unchecked, close that, and now we can use Alt and the left button to orbit, Alt and both buttons to pan, and Alt and the right button to zoom in and out. Now there's not much context here at the moment because we haven't actually got any data loaded in. So if we now look at how we would load data into Vicon Shogun Post, and we can go from there. So I'm just going to close these side windows because I prefer to have just the right hand side set up. That's just a matter of preference for me. But again, you can find your own way of working that works for you. But to be able to access the database, we are going to have to open the data management panel, which opens up here. I'm going to drag and open it into a floating window, which means I've still got some more real estate and I can minimize that out of the way. And here you can see the database. So if I go into open a database and I can browse. So let me just remove this one now. And I'll remove the other ones so you can see a blank window. So when you first open at home, you'll probably see a window that looks like this. So now I'm going to click the browse button. And I'm going to find the location in which I saved that folder. So backup, CT6 mocap, and then this CT6 mocap fight sequence. Just going to view details. So mocap fight sequence, mocap data folder, and then we select this ENF file, which is the parent file for the database. This describes all of the different categories within. Now the handout gives a better overview of that, so I can refer you back to that, to a description of how the data structure works in the database. But if I click open now, you can see there, and click open again, and I now have this database. So what you will see within the database for the data for the assessment is we have a project, which was CT6 mocap, a capture day, which is the 9th of January, and a session, which was a 9 a.m. session. And within that, you can see all of our individual takes that have been recorded during that capture session. Now, the first thing we did was calibrate our characters, which is Andy and Lyndall with their ROMs and their swords. And then we shot 2 fight takes, fight section 104, fight section 2002. And then you'll notice there's some new ROMs. Now, when we did our demo in the mocap room, I talked to you about how sometimes we have to recalibrate actors if their markers are missing or there are any problems during the day with the shoot. Their suit comes off, they have to go for a comfort break or move the suit. Then we would normally recalibrate our actors by doing ROMs. And that's what we've done here. We've recaptured them as ROM003. This was because they were practicing some kind of heavy duty kind of grappling scenes, and the markers were falling off the suit and the tracking was getting less stable. So we did a ROM and then did a take of the fight section 3A05, which you'll see. Now, importantly, when we record data using the new Shogun software, you no longer have to calibrate all of the actors and import them manually like we did with Faisal's battle scene. You might remember that we calibrated his subject as a ROM and then imported it into the scene. This has already been done for you guys because we recorded in Shogun Live and all of those characters are automatically loaded in the scene. So we need to refer back to these at a later date, the ROMs, for calibrating our actors for and exporting for Motion Builder. But for the time being, you can jump straight in and open up the fight sequence by double clicking on the green icon, which is a VDF file. So if we double click on this little green icon here, and it loads in the file. I'm just going to close the database window. So now you can see here we have our mocap loaded in, and you can see there's already subjects loaded in for Lyndall and Andy. So if we look at our panels menu, we can see the subject management window is open. So let's jump over to that and see what's come in with the scene. So here we can see our subjects at the top, our actors, Andy and Lyndall, with the ROM, the calibrated labeling setup and solving setup. And here we have little green dots to tell us that we have a labeling setup present and a solving setup present for both of them. And for our props, we only now have labeling setups for props, but there are labeling setups loaded in for each of our swords. Now, if we look in the window here, we can see that we have certain things visible. And now I can go through some more of the options for the Shogun Post UI now that we have some data loaded in. So let's have a look at our main window. As we can see, I am orbiting with Alt and the left mouse button, zooming with the right mouse button, and then panning with two buttons together because I set the preferences up in general preferences. And we have a lot of view options now. So we looked earlier on at the type of viewport. So I can change to 3D scene, or let's have a look down through each of them. I can look at the graph. Nothing's in there at the moment because nothing's selected. I can look at NLE, which is very rarely used, which is like a non-linear editing window where you can join clips together. We're not going to cover that. Hierarchy gives you a view of the data structure within. So you can see here we have different top nodes and other ownership parts in here. This is just a kind of visual representation of the data structure within the file. And then we have the cameras view, which actually shows you the individual viewpoints from each of the cameras. I can double click on one of those to show it full screen, and then you can see what was happening in there, and I can double click to close it back. And then data health. Now, this is based on whatever subject we've got. So here you can see it says Andy, and it shows each of the markers in the marker set and shows you where the corresponding gaps are. This is just a visual representation, just so you can look at the health of the data. We could look at this and see that there's not that many gaps in this take for us, but we don't actually use this as a cleanup tool. So I would suggest you can have a look at it, but we might not use it. So if we go back to the 3D scene window, now we can see our take. Now, some of you might be thinking why the middle mouse button isn't used for navigating in the window. Because we have to do a lot of scrubbing of time and advancing frames, this is the function of the middle mouse button in the Shogun UI. If you press and hold the middle mouse button, I can scrub along the timeline. Yeah, I can scrub backwards and forwards to see what's going on. And if I roll the mouse button backwards and forwards, I get frame advance, so I can go in and finally adjust the frames that I'm on for selection or looking at problems, because it's a very regular task that we use within the software. So the middle mouse button gives us that opportunity. So it's Alt, you don't have to press Alt, middle mouse button to scrub, hold down and scrub, or roll it backwards and forwards to get frame by frame advance. Now, as with most software, we have selection filters and view filters, which are up here on our viewport. So next to the 3D scene, we have this context window. You'll notice if I turn it to graph, it's gone. If I go back to 3D scene, it becomes the ability to pick a perspective or orthographic views. Yeah. So we can go to front view and get straight on views and have a look. Perspective is the preferred one when we're cleaning data. So I'll stick to that one for now, but at least you know it's there. Now, if we look at the selection filters, if we click this button, we now get selection filters for everything that's in here. As default, everything is on. And if I try and select things, I can select cameras, bones, etc. When we are cleaning mocap data, we only need to look at markers and select markers. So I would set, as default, set all of those to off, and then check in subjects and in props markers, including during gaps. Yeah. We can go back and look at this later on. During gaps can be slightly awkward, but if I now drag a marquee in the window and select, you can see it's only selected markers and not any of the bones or any of the other objects within the view. Yeah? If I turn off that selection filters menu for a moment, and now we can have a look at view filters, and you can see there's a lot of options in here for the things we want to look at. But what we normally do is we will look at our solving skeleton. So you can click here. If I go labeling, you see it jumps to the very simplistic labeling skeleton, which we don't use for export. We only use this as tracking and labeling. And then if we jump to the solve level of the menu, it changes the solving skeleton to the bones. And down here in this kind of matrix, we can turn more things off. L represents labeling, S represents solving, R means retargeting, and P is for props. We are not doing any retargeting within this unit within Shogun, so we can ignore retargeting for now. But we will be using props. So I can turn on and off the bones for the props. So let's zoom in and see one of our props. You can see the bone is there for it. I can't select it at the moment because the filter is off, but you can see that the bones are visible. And if I check that for props, they disappear. And if I check that for solving bones, they will disappear. Clusters, we use those sometimes. These are predefined clusters that we can assign to characters, so ignore that one. Constraints we don't need on. Markers for props and labeling we need. And sticks are the things that join them together, which are a useful visual guide, which I will cover in a later video about cleaning process and cleaning workflow. And again, during gaps, I don't particularly think we need to look at sticks, markers for that during gaps. I find that confusing. And again, we can put skins on if we so wish for solving. So I can put the skin on, I can make it X-ray. I find those distracting whilst I'm cleaning, so I tend to have those boxes unchecked. You can even set your own preset. I've made one here called tracking. So if I do come down here and turn on lots of these things, so if I go into kind of that, solving, skin for that, then I don't like that. I can nip back to retarget and then go to tracking. It will automatically set them for the preset that you are on. So it might get a little confusing, but just try different options and understand how that matrix works and find out something that works for you too. So if we move across now in this user interface, we can see the tracking options next to view filters. Now we can turn these on. We've covered this within the workshops, but in case you can't remember, we can track markers. So if we're working on the head, I would select all the markers in the head. I would hit the F key to frame them. And then if I wanted to track that, so if I scrub now, you see it might move out of view. So if I go to track selection, and now if I scrub time, the view keeps it framed in the middle. The keyboard shortcut for that is the X key. And to cancel that is the C key. So Again, to recap, what I would normally do, just quickly, to start at a take, I would start at the beginning frame. I would choose an actor to work on, say Lyndall, press F to frame, X to track, and then I could start operating on working on those markers that I have selected. Other menus options up here, we can track orientation, which I don't ever really use. Snap view to the model, which is the same as F effectively. We can check the Z up, but we don't tend to use that, and show all clips. The other important one that you can use here is marker size. So we can go 1 or 2 in that, and I would normally have 2 because you can see the markers more clearly and it makes the sticks more visible. So as you can see, I automatically went into pan mode then, but I can't because I have tracking active. So if I press the C to cancel tracking, I can now use both mouse buttons to pan around. If tracking is active, you cannot pan the view. You can orbit, you can zoom, but you cannot pan. So if you find it stuck, then you might realize that you've got that option on. Press C to cancel it and you'll be able to pan again. So here now we've got this. So if you'll notice, if I select a marker, there's an important box at the top called current subject. Yeah. Now if I select something on Lyndall, it automatically switches between the active subject, the current subject. If I select something on Andy, it jumps to Andy. That is because this button is on. Current subject follows selection. I can now turn that off, and if I select something on Andy or Lyndall, it doesn't switch automatically. If I turn it back on, if I select markers on different subjects, it automatically switches, including the props. This can be very useful when you are jumping around and trying to fix things and choose which is on which. But in a more advanced video that I will cover, you'll see how we can turn this off to make life easier, especially when we are labeling and we need to label something that belongs to a different subject or character, etc. I'll cover that as we come to it, rather than confusing the issue now. There are other options here that we can put on, which is, if it will do the mouse over tooltip here, gap dimming, we don't need to worry about that, and show marker trails is irrelevant for what we are doing here. So now we should be able to navigate around in the windows, set up our preferences, and start looking at how our keyboard shortcuts work and loading data in. So an overview of the UI should be fairly useful. This should provide that and support the Word document and give you an alternative if you don't like following the Word document. And in the next video, I will cover kind of workflow on how we would clean data. And then I can bring a lot more of the other menu options into context rather than try and do it all in one big long video and confuse people. So I'll post this up on the channel shortly and you'll be able to access it via the playlist. And then I'll continue on, like I said, with an example workflow video and then sort of tips and tricks as we move on.